We okay? Good evening. How's everyone doing tonight? I'm so pleased you're here. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Marie Colvin Center's annual Distinguished Lecture. It's always a really exciting event. I'm Laura Linenfeld. I'm Dean of the School of Communication and Journalism and also serve as Executive Director for the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science here at Stony Brook University. Let me first just say some thank yous. Sarah Baxter, who will join me shortly, for organizing this amazing event, along with so many other folks, Chris, Tima, a whole bunch of, it takes a village to make events like this happen. So I'm just really grateful to the team and to all of you for coming out to learn more about journalism and support journalism. We need that so badly now. I'm really honored that we're able to host this event tonight with Rhona. You'll meet her shortly to discuss, and this is always the nature of these events, timely and pressing issues in journalism. And to have our students, faculty, and staff and leaders from the field gather together. So there will be time for conversation. It won't just be us talking to you. You'll have time to step in. The Colvin Center, headed by the fantastic Professor Sarah Baxter, is really central to the School of Communication and Journalism programs. They work to prepare the next generation of foreign correspondents to report from the front lines in honor of Marie Colvin, whose sister is here tonight, and we'll talk as well in a minute. These are missions that are often difficult, dangerous even, yet critical to the functioning of a global society and to democracy. I want to highlight, we with donor support have an amazing opportunity to bring a group that Sarah's leading this summer to Sweden to report on gender-related issues in Sweden, right, Sarah? Yeah, it's really exciting. Maybe that will come up more and you can respond a little bit about that as well. The center is inspired by the life of the late Marie Colvin, who really died too young. We strive to uphold the same causes for which she dedicated her life, and it's become ever more pressing in the work of journalists around the world to shed light on truth for democracy. Let me just say that again. Truth for democracy. Human rights and freedom of expression. Furthermore, this work is so critical in the fight for justice and support of victims of war, displacement, and gender-based violence. And as they work to bring accurate and uncensored information to the world, we must continue to give attention to the safety and well-being of journalists themselves, who really often put their lives and well-being on the line. Our topic for the evening is open source journalism. This is such an interesting and really important area of great consequence. Open source investigators, if you're not familiar with this, use internet tools like satellite imaging and social media verification to uncover some of the biggest stories of our times. They allow reporters to peer into closed societies and conflict zones and expose disinformation, human rights abuses, and war crimes, amongst other things. All journalists need to know about this increasingly vital way to establish the truth and hold the powerful to account. In this country, I feel like I have to say a few words about this. We have a constitutional responsibility to uphold and support freedom of the press. We hear a lot about freedom of speech. I think it's worth spending a moment on freedom of the press. Journalism is absolutely vital to a healthy democracy. And journalism as education, which is what we do in the school, amongst other things, is critical to ensuring we have journalists who know how to report truthfully and accurately about things that matter most to society. I'm so proud we have faculty joining us tonight. Can those of you who teach in the school please stand? We need to give you a round of applause. So grateful that you are here. And I know we have a bunch of students. Let me see all the students who are here tonight, whether you're from the School of Communication and Journalism. Yay! Terrific. Oh, awesome. You are why we're here. You're why we're here. That's why we're gathered here this evening to welcome this year's distinguished lecturer, the executive editor of CBS News Confirmed, Rhona Tarrant. Welcome, Rhona, and thank you for joining us at Stony Brook. You made your way all the way out here. We also have with us Kat Colvin, who I'm going to call up here in a minute. Kat has been absolutely instrumental in the formation and advancement of the Colvin Center, and we're so honored to have you with us tonight. To hear your insights on the current conflict zones, both of you, the challenges journalists continue to face as they do their jobs. This year, it's been 13 years since Marie's murder. The Syrian dictator and war criminal Bashar al-Assad was finally ousted. Yes. Kat, I'm so thrilled you're here to join us, and I invite you to share a few words before we call up Sarah.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all so much for coming tonight. It means a lot to me, and I know that Marie would be incredibly honored at such a meaningful way to honor her memory, and also by so many talented and passionate people here tonight and who have worked so hard not just to bring this event together, but to keep the Marie Colvin Center thriving, and especially for our speaker tonight, who I was really thrilled to get to meet, Rhona Tarrant. Marie was, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Marie, my sister, and a little bit about Marie, the journalist. Marie really was the most amazing sister, aunt, and daughter. She was also admired and respected by so many as a friend, a colleague, a mentor, especially to young women and young journalists. It has been 13 years this month since she was targeted and murdered by the Assad regime as part of their very successful war strategy to silence the press in Syria. Only recently, journalists are beginning to get back in, but after Marie's murder, it was very difficult and dangerous to report from there. And I'm really interested in hearing what Rhona has to say on some alternatives to that on-the-ground reporting. Not a day goes by for me, even now, that I don't think about her or regale my friends with stories of our misadventures together, and always miss her deeply. I retired recently from a very demanding career, not as demanding as Marie's, but whose is. And I really feel her loss acutely in these days. We had so many terrible ideas of where to retire together, ranging from my attic, rigged up with a dumbwaiter to get vodka and cigarettes up to her, to some remote tropical island being served by cabana boys, which I much preferred. But wherever it might have been, we should have been together to share this next chapter. Let me tell you a little bit also about Marie, the war correspondent. I'm sure many or most of you here are familiar with her career, but it bears repeating and reminding about what an important voice was lost when Marie was taken from us. Marie spent nearly 30 years covering war and conflict around the world, most famously in the Middle East, but also Chechnya, the Balkans, East Timor, Sri Lanka, too many to name, really. She went to the center of wherever the storm was brewing or raging, and it really did take a toll on her. In 1999, she refused to evacuate a UN compound in East Timor that was under attack by government forces and surrounded because there were more than 1,500 civilians trapped there with no way to escape or get to safety. She knew that if she left, the military would have overrun the compound, slaughtering the civilians. Marie called me several times from the compound. It was unusual that she would have access to so many telephones and unlimited power sources, so she took advantage of that. She described the atrocities she was witnessing, children being thrown over chain link fences to save them, But mostly she was calling to say goodbye and to apologize for leaving too soon. She knew she was risking her life by staying, but she judged it worth the risk, as she did so many times over the course of her career. Thanks in part to Marie's firsthand reports, those particular people were rescued, and Marie and 2 other female journalists who stayed as well were credited with saving those 1,500 lives. A few years later, she lost her eye in a grenade attack in Sri Lanka, where she was the first journalist to make it into rebel-controlled territory in or almost a decade. But that injury didn't stop her. She remained committed to bringing the reality of war to our doorsteps in the unwavering belief that it would make a difference. It was that faith in humanity and her empathy for victims of war that led her to home Syria in 2012, which was under siege, and that is where she was killed. She would have been horrified at what followed in Syria. More than a decade of slaughter and destruction, supported by Russia, who propped up a vicious and corrupt regime, ran devastating air raids on the Syrian people, and provided arms and supplies to government forces. Once that support waned, the people of Syria seized the moment with an amazing lightning speed offensive that toppled the Assad regime in just over a week. I wish Marie had been here to see the jubilation in the streets as the people took back their country. That jubilation has settled into the hard work of rebuilding a country decimated by war. To me, the early signs have been very positive. The new government has been inclusive and moderate in its initial messaging, but they do face an extremely challenging task, hobbled by international sanctions, shortages of power and basic needs, including shelter, continuing attacks along the borders, and multiple factions to manage within Syria. This week, the EU and Britain lifted the most significant of their sanctions on energy, transportation, and banking, which I hope will ease the path to rebuild Syria. The lifting of those sanctions is contingent upon a peaceful transition to democracy, which gives further cause for hope. US sanctions do remain in place, and given the recent alignment of the US with Russia, including voting with Russia on the recent UN resolutions around the invasion of Ukraine, it seems unlikely that the US will lift sanctions soon. But Syria's interim leader, Ahmad al-Sharaa, recently spoke with Putin, who still has 2 military bases in Syria. So, and apparently discussions are ongoing. So there's a potential for normalization. I think that if Russia normalizes those relations with Syria, and this is horrible to say, but my guess is that the US would follow suit. What we do know is that it's an extremely complex and fluid situation in Syria right now. Most disturbing to me personally is the escape by many of Assad's henchmen and some complicit family members to neighboring countries where they live freely. The head of the government informants network, who was instrumental in locating and targeting Marie, even returned to Syria to begin running his car dealership again. Local protests apparently drove him back into hiding, but I'm sure he's not the only one walking the streets freely. I'm hopeful that there'll be a truth and reconciliation process that will bring them to justice, not just for me and my family, but so many victims of that regime. So far, there's no indication that Syria is going to choose that path. It also remains to be seen what role women and minority groups will play in the new Syria. But I am optimistic that the people's desire for peace and freedom, which was so hard fought and hard won, will dominate Syrian politics going forward. We started the Marie Colvin Center to support activities like this lecture series and to train and inspire young journalists and upcoming generations of journalists to get them out in the field safely, reporting and learning. That's why the Marie Colvin Center is so important, not only to remember Marie and preserve her legacy, but to reinforce the importance of having reporters on the ground to bear witness and keep all of us informed. I just want to close by reading a quote from Marie. War reporting is still essentially the same. Someone has to go there and see what's happening. You can't get that information without going to places where people are being shot at and others are shooting at you. The real difficulty is having enough faith in humanity to believe that enough people, be they government, military, or the man on the street, will care when your file reaches the printed page, the website, or the TV screen. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Laura. Thank you.
And with no further ado, in the spirit of creating a fairer, more just, more rational world, which is what we're after in the school, let me welcome to the stage Sarah Baxter and Rhona Tarrant.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. It was so moving to hear Kat speak about Marie, and I know how much she is missed every day by so many journalists who worked with her and loved her. So it is wonderful to have Rhona Tarrant of CBS News confirmed here with us today as the Distinguished Marie Colvin Lecturer for 2025. And I wanted to start by saying that Rhona and I got to know each other while she was working for Storyful, which was a very innovative startup in this open source intelligence field. And she was head of editorial there and did such a splendid job. And she actually spoke at a meeting of the Colvin Center a couple of years ago on the women's uprising in Iran. Now, this was a closed society where people couldn't see what was going on except through open source journalism. So she's going to explain more about that in her talk. But so at Storyful, she was working for, breaking award-winning investigations for the New York Times, for the Wall Street Journal. But before that, she was a broadcast journalist. She is again at CBS, but she started, like so many of our students, entering the field of broadcast journalism. So she worked in Ireland for RTE and then moved to WNYC in New York. And I should add, she's a two-time Assembly Fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, where she focused on disinformation and artificial intelligence. And she's also trained journalists through Google News initiatives and also the Facebook project. So she has a lot of experience as an educator, a communicator, and a real pioneer in her field. But so I'm going to just start by saying, so why did you switch from being the broadcast journalist to being the open source expert?
Well, that is a great question. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Laura, Kat, Sarah. It's really such an honor. Marie Colvin is definitely a personal hero of mine, so it's really an honor to be here. So when I was starting out in journalism, it was around the time, like when I was doing my undergrad, I would buy a newspaper in the morning, which sounds so twee now. But journalism changed so much when I was in college. So I was sort of trained in the very traditional way. And when I came out of college first, I knew I wanted to get into broadcast journalism. So it took me a long time. I was not one of those people who went into it easily. I started working for the national broadcaster eventually, and I became a radio reporter, and I started working in a little bit in TV as well. So I started learning this trade. I absolutely loved it. I loved storytelling. I started getting good at editing. I was really kind of making my way, but I got to a point in my career where I was sort of getting good enough that I was getting really good opportunities, but all of this stuff was happening on social media, and I just wasn't learning it in the newsroom that I was in RTE at the time. So I made the leap. So my editor at the time offered me a role, and at the same time, Storyful offered me a role, and this is one of those pioneering organizations. So I had, which is a very strange thing in journalism, by the way, getting two job offers at the same time. So I took it was a head over heart decision. I was like, I need to learn this stuff if I'm going to last long term. So I went into the head of news's office. And I said, I'm so sorry, I'm going to go, but I'll be back in 6 months. I'm going to go learn the skills and I'll be back in 6 months. That was 8 years ago. I never went back. It took me over 7 years at Storyful to learn these skills, and I'm still learning them every day. So for me, it was really a practicality. This stuff is sort of playing out on social media. At the time, it was sort of this new and emerging field. But right now, the reality of it is, this is just mainstream journalism now. So if you go into local reporting, national, international reporting, you are going to have to do this type of work. So it's still an emerging field. We definitely have a skills gap in the industry, but I think at the time it was really, I need this to survive long term.
Yeah, well, that's a good message for our journalism students. So now about that time when you were just sort of starting off in that career and Storyful was coming into being, a couple of years earlier, there had been the Arab Spring. And this was one of the great moments when social media exploded. And I just want to take a little moment of your time because to explain where Marie and open source journalism fits in together. So I was reading a book just a few days ago, and it's called We Are Bellingcat. It's by Elliot Higgins, who is one of the sort of founders of open source journalism. And on page 12, that early on in his book, I found a big section devoted to Marie. And I'm just going to read you a few words because I was really moved by this. And it really shows that direct link. So she gets this herogram from Elliot Higgins on page 12. So he writes that Colvin was renowned for her courage and distinctive eye patch, which of course we know. But he goes on to say, after Colvin's death, even fewer Western journalists dared to enter Syria. And in their absence, the war grew crueler, which is an important point. He said, its evils would have been hidden from the world were it not for the internet. And more than any other conflict in history, this war included social media as a component of the fighting. And anyway, I was very struck by that because, Rhona, this is where you come in. And, tell us about how open source intelligence complements that vital boots on the ground reporting, which of course we believe in and we practice here at Stony Brook.
Yeah, so it might help to kind of explain, I suppose, where my part of CBS News fits in overall. And I think that goes to how this has become so central to journalism in general. So CBS set up this unit about a year ago, so last April. And the whole idea is basically an open source team at the center of CBS News, not just for conflict reporting or our foreign reporting, but also for our business reporting, for our investigative unit, for our crime unit. The whole idea behind this is social media and what's happening online and what you can find online is a part of every story. So what I mean by the open source journalism in general, it means verifying images and videos from breaking news stories, whether that's a terror attack in New Orleans or a plane crash in DC or California wildfires, which all happened in January. My team is the team who are finding that stuff, verifying it and pushing it out so that we know we're verifying and we're producing and broadcasting real visuals, particularly in the age of AI. But it's also understanding counter narratives and how those are playing out online, particularly. So my team also does fact checking. We do live fact checking for some of the big events, for example. So these false claims that are taking off online, my team is responsible for fact checking and verifying them for the network. But we also track, as if we're not doing enough, we also track organized disinformation campaigns. Now those can be state related, so and I'll talk about that a little bit, but like they are related to governments sometimes. So very sophisticated groups who push out counter narratives to things. But also for profit companies now we're seeing people understand the role of like social media and shaping the public narratives because that's where people are getting their news. So in terms of like where it's been and where it's come from, like CBS, I think, particularly now, that was the reason it was being set up, is it's touching every part of journalism, but also particularly, I think, in the age of AI and that sort of paranoia about people not being able to believe what they see.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And it's very much something that we want to be able to bring to our students in future. the skills building in this field. So Rhona's lecture is a really important contribution to that. And just to say, our faith remains undimmed in hands-on foreign reporting. And she probably won't thank me for this, but we have here tonight Ivana Stolnik. And it's thanks to Ivana's generosity that we're able to take 10 students on a fully funded trip to Sweden yeah, and they're going to get that incredible experience of going places and finding out what's really going on, the sort of thing that Marie really believed in. So, Rhona, I'm now going to sit back and I'm going to let you do all the hard work because you're going to present your lecture now. And if I'm not looking behind me on screen, it's because I can see monitors in front. So I'll just stay here.
You're just dozing off. So, I mean, you know, when I was thinking about this talk and thinking about how to present this, I was thinking about how this has evolved over the space of my own career and just talking about it from my own perspective. I could talk about so many conflicts, but I only have 30 minutes. But also, I really want to make clear that this does not replace journalists on the ground. That work is so vital. And this will never replace it. But the whole idea is that it can help journalists on the ground and it can help newsrooms. And it's a new layer of reporting that can supplement and help that work. So in terms of when I was thinking about this, I wanted to give a brief overview about how this had changed during my career, particularly as this is a university. So I'm going to give 3 snapshots. This is in no way a holistic way of looking at how open source journalism has changed news, but these are the main changes during my career. So the first one is the Arab Spring. This was when I was still in college, but this was one of the first events where I really realized that social media was sort of changing the game, both for how news was breaking online, but also how newsrooms were covering it. So the Arab Spring was a series of protests. It was actually the very end of 2010 into 2011 and onwards, where a number of anti-government protests in several Middle Eastern countries. Now, these protests spread far and wide, but it was the first sort of major global event that I took notice of where social media was really key. So platforms like YouTube and Facebook, which were so new at the time, were being used by activists and protests to organize, to share their videos and upload their videos, to connect with each other, but also to document what was happening on the ground. Now, this sounds so basic now, but this was really incredible. And it also presented a new challenge for newsrooms because newsrooms didn't know how do I know where this is actually from? How do I know how to verify this? So Storyful, which is where I worked, that's actually around the time that Storyful got up and going and really got into newsrooms because Storyful became the news agency that actually verified this stuff. So that was sort of the first step, I would say, during my career. Also, while some governments fell, there was obviously brutal crackdowns in some areas. And it also became obvious that social media was also a tool for surveillance, for spreading propaganda, for helping to crack down on things. So for example, like cutting off the internet or shutting down a social media platform, those are so common now during protests in countries, but this was unheard of at the time. You know, people hadn't even thought about this. So really sort of the Arab Spring sort of brought those things to light, how it could both be used as sort of a tool for good and also a tool for repression. The second was the weaponization. I think when you're talking about the evolution of open source journalism and social media and news gathering, you have to talk, unfortunately, about how ISIS weaponized social media in a very systemic way. Like the most obvious one being when they were entering northern Iraq in 2014, they got a hashtag trending, for example, on Twitter at the time, hashtag all eyes on ISIS. So when they were like entering Mosul, entering northern Iraq, the online sort of conversation about them was just overwhelming. So they figured out, for example, how to produce very slick videos and post them online to spread fear, how to produce very slick propaganda. But this also was, you know, it was also hard to see where the wood was from the trees, like what was actually happening versus what was the illusion. So for newsrooms, that was a challenge as well. Like, how do you cover this stuff? Now, they got kicked off Twitter, but then they went to Telegram, for example. So in any newsroom, like most journalists didn't know where to go, how to cover these things. So that was another challenge for newsrooms. And the third thing, and this was by the time I was at Storyful, was the Douma chemical attack. Again, I could pick so many examples, but this one always stands out in my mind. So this was a chemical attack that killed over 40 people in Douma in Syria in 2018. So it was in April. Immediately after this event happened, we had sources obviously on the ground in Syria that we were using. And by our sources, we mean, like, for example, the White Helmets channels. We knew there were local activists. We knew the right places that were like uploading this stuff. So our team's job is to go through all these videos and document them and to make sure that, you know, they're verified. So we had verified all these videos. We knew it was in Douma. We knew it was very likely a chemical attack. There were great journalists on the ground who went in and got videos of the bomb. And it was very obvious very early on what happened. Now you have the OPCW who hadn't at that point conducted any investigation, and they were actually being kept away. But at this point, we were fairly confident in knowing that this was a chemical attack that was likely perpetrated by the Assad regime. Very early on, a counter narrative started spreading, which was alleging that, I mean, many different things, but it's the usual stuff of, for example, this was staged, this was faked, these were actors. And it was very sophisticated and it was very loud. And that was one of the first times in my career when I was covering this stuff that I realized how much even the stuff that we're doing is being weaponized. So we were using these videos, we were sending them out to newsrooms, making sure this was being covered. At the same time, these same images and videos were being used by people who were trying to spread disinformation, to say, actually, you're seeing that, but that's really not what it shows. So those are sort of, I'll speak to these points, but those were sort of the three key things that have changed over my career. And of course, at this point, we're in a much more sophisticated place by 2025, where these tactics of weaponization of social media and also using it to spread disinformation is very sophisticated for a lot of these actors. But I wanted to pick, obviously, we have the anniversary of the Ukraine war, or the full-scale invasion this week. So I wanted to pick an example to talk through where I could demonstrate how much our work also relies on journalists on the ground, and those two things are not in silo. So I want to talk about one of the stories that really affected me when I was covering it. So this was a Russian strike on a hospital in Mariupol in 2022. So this is a photograph of an Associated Press photographer, Evgeny Malaka. Sorry, I'm so bad at pronunciations. He's pointing to a smoke rising from an airstrike. So at this point, he's done some interviews about this, and it's just a really striking story. So they were filming in another part of the city. They heard airstrikes. They rush to the window and they see smoke rising. So they start driving to the site. And we'll return to him in a second. But as all this was happening, I was at my desk in New York. And my team was also monitoring this stuff. So we were getting it sort of separately. Now, this is what my team is doing on any given day. You have the journalists on the ground, but you have a team in any newsroom. So we were back in New York. News for us often breaks first on social media. So a team like mine, we're monitoring global platforms for keywords and trending topics. So my team's job essentially is to be online all day, every day, trying to figure out what the big news events are and what we should be covering. So this is just one screenshot of a data miner. This is one example of, if we were monitoring Mariupol. So we're monitoring feeds all across the internet. We're taking in videos all day long, and we're trying to figure out what's happening. So in terms of tools you can use, particularly for conflicts, one of the biggest, you have your journalists on the ground who are gathering their sources. My team's sources look like Telegram channels, Facebook pages, X lists. So Telegram is a messaging platform, for those of you who don't know. It's kind of like a WhatsApp, but Telegram has become one of the key platforms for the Ukraine war. It's used by Russians and it's used by Ukrainians. But this is where we get most of our information. So whenever a major event happens in Ukraine, we're monitoring these social media channels, these Telegram channels, to see what videos are emerging. So we're gathering our list of groups. We monitor local governments. We monitor aggregator accounts. So there's some accounts who basically work on the ground and they aggregate everything. So actually makes our job a little bit harder. And then we also have professional tools in newsrooms as well. So we have the likes of like Data Miner, which is a tool that pulls in alerts from Reddit and websites and Twitter and Facebook and blogs. And it's pulling into this feed of stuff that it uses machine learning, and it thinks that you might be interested in it. So this is all to say, if you're an open source reporter, you better get ready for your brain to be frazzled on any given day. So I just want to show you one quick thing, and I really want to get into the weeds of this because I really want people to understand like how we do it and what we do. So this is an example of a string search. So my team would have, if we knew there was shelling or anything happening in Mariupol, we would do a string search of like shelling, put that in Ukrainian, airstrike, Mariupol. So we're monitoring all day long. So we heard this event had happened. Obviously, we heard it was a hospital, so we knew that it was important. So I just want to show you next some of the videos that first emerged. So my team, this will be what will come to us. And we're kind of going into this blind, right? We're not often talking to the reporters on the ground because they're very busy and in a very dangerous place and they don't need our questions. So we're often going in blind. So as you can see, it's a big square building. You can see some patients coming out. You can see a car on fire. You can see a very distressing scene. You can see there's been a big explosion, like a lot of damage. You can also see scenes from inside. Now stop it there. So how do we know this is real? How do we know this is from today? How do we know this is the event? And keeping in mind, you have a deadline here. I was working at Storyful at the time. You have many, many newsrooms who want this footage now. So this is the role of an open source team. This footage comes out. How do we know it's real? How do we know it's from today? And tell me right now. So I'm going to break it down for you, how we would verify this piece of footage. So there are 3 principles of visual verification, and these were developed by Storyful, but they're pretty much used by everybody across the industry. So first of all is your location. How do I know where this is? Second thing is date. How do I know when this was filmed? And the third thing is the source, like who's giving me this stuff? Where does it come from? So let's start with number 1. The first thing you do is you slow it down. So in the video, I will always stop. I will watch it the whole way through. I will listen to it the whole way through. And I'll pick out things and just pay attention. So what am I looking at here? At the top, we have a row of trees that line up right in front of a building. We also have a square design, which is like there's a bridging thing in between them. And then we also have a yellow building and a green building and a yellow and green. And we also have a wide open space. Now, this sounds, again, super obvious, but a lot of open source journalism is really just noticing the details. So what do I do next? Google Maps. It's one of our most useful tools in open source journalism. So I go to Google Maps and I try to figure out where in the world is this hospital. So I've heard there's a hospital in Mariupol. So luckily on Google Maps, you can type in hospital and it will actually bring up all of the hospitals in the area, or a lot of the hospitals in the area. So then I start searching. I go into the satellite imagery and I zoom in and I start looking at every single one of the hospitals and I start looking for something that might look like it, which brought me to hospital number 3 in Mariupol. So this is labeled as a hospital, which was our first good sign. The second thing is you can see right there's like a little bridge thing. You can also see yellow and green. You can see a row of trees that are right in front of the building, and you can also see a wide open space. So I put those 2 things together and it's a match. So I verified that this is hospital number 3 in Mariupol, and we're probably dealing with authentic footage. But I don't stop there. I want to make sure we get the other 2 questions answered. And that is date. That's your second thing. How do I know this isn't old footage? So all of these local officials started reporting it in these Telegram channels very early on. So they all started reporting it around the same time. Several different videos started emerging at the same time. So loads of different angles. This is all really a really good sign. If you're getting one video coming out of nowhere and you're seeing nothing else similar, that's a red flag. But we're seeing lots of things at the same time. And we also saw no evidence of a previous strike at this site. So I'm going to show you another tool, which is bringing Google Maps a little step further. And this is Google Earth. So Google Earth used to be like a private tool, and now anybody can access it. It's one of the most amazing, I love it. It's one of those amazing tools out there. But for stories like this, particularly if you're working in war zones where buildings and statues and things are getting destroyed all the time, it can often be a really helpful tool to date something. So I'm going to show you a little video here. Google Earth has a tool called historical imagery. So Google collects satellite imagery of all over the world all the time. So when you go on Google Maps, you'll see the most up-to-date that it has. This satellite has been orbiting the globe for many, many years, and it's taken in images from many, many years. So on Google Earth, you can actually access the history of satellite imagery. So I'm just going to show you a very quick tip. You can see at the top, you just hit this little button, which is an Earth, and this is showing me hospital number 2. Now, this is from 2022. You can actually see the damage from the airstrike is still there. but I just pulled this up yesterday and took a video. So I'm going back through time here. This is showing me 2022, 2022. Again, you can still see the hospital damage is still there. But then we get to June 2021 before the strike. So at the time, the closest I had was 2021, but I could see that there was no damage at that hospital. But particularly when you're working in open source investigations, it's amazing how much information is actually out there. So that's another quick tool. If any of you guys are interested in it, I would recommend getting to know Google Earth because it's an incredible resource for verifying information. The next is metadata. Now, I didn't really have to use metadata in this story because I had enough to go on, but I want to just like one word about metadata. So when you take an image or video on your phone and you get your memories up on your phone, it's saying, do you want to see where you were this time last year? That's metadata. So when I take a video or image on my phone, it captures not just the photo, but it gives me loads of data related to it. So that means what time of day, when, sometimes the altitude, what type of camera was used. Now, the great thing about Telegram, this Telegram app that's so widely used, is it actually preserves metadata. So anything that's sent through, you can actually get the original metadata from the file, which will confirm where something was filmed, when it was filmed, if that's been captured. So this is just one example, it'll show your create date is that day, whatever time of day it is. I didn't need to use it in this situation, but particularly for open source, metadata analysis is extremely helpful. It can often show you as well if something's been manipulated. One caveat about metadata, it is absolutely not foolproof. It can be manipulated, so somebody can go in and change metadata. So my team, when we're doing this stuff, we always use it as a data point, like one thing to look at in a broader picture, as you can see, but it's never the be-all and end-all to confirm that something is authentic. And finally, let's talk about source. So this was released by Mariupol City Council. One of the biggest things my team will do is we'll search online for the earliest version of a piece of footage. We always want to get to the source. Like ideally, my team wants to interview the person on the ground who's filmed this footage, wherever it is, whether it's Gaza or it's Ukraine or Sudan or wherever it is. That's not always possible. For many reasons, my team is never going to talk to original sources. So often in war zones, the original sources are not going to be accessible to us. So often they're hiding their identities for safety reasons. Maybe they're passing on footage to the city council and then the city council is posting it. So unlike the reporters on the ground who are doing that vital work of talking to people, my team is often kind of feeling around in the dark. But finding the earliest version can help us to go back closer to the original source if we can. Confirming the account is authentic. So you would be amazed by the amount of fake Telegram channels that are trying to convince people of things. So for example, like being fraudulently saying that they're the local city council to put out fake information. So like a simple thing you would do with this is you would go back through the page and just make sure that before the war, they were posting boring updates about city council meetings. That's a really good sign that it's an authentic account. If it was created just 2 days before, that's a red flag. So just verifying their posting history. I know I'm going into the weeds here, but when you are working in open source, you have to pay attention to absolutely everything because you're so far away. You don't have that like face-to-face on the ground context. You have to pay attention to all of the clues. And in this case, they were the first posters of this piece of footage. So I want to talk now about this image. It was taken by that AP photographer when he arrived on the ground. So it became one of the most famous images. This was one of the patients at the hospital who was just coming out of the building when AP arrived. And it was just a really striking image of a pregnant woman who was leaving the hospital. But it also became one of the most contested images of this event. And it became contested very, very early on. So the day after this happened, numerous other Telegram channels started popping up with a little counter narrative. So was this really a maternity hospital? Did this really happen? So in this case, this woman was targeted. They alleged that she was an actor. Well, there were several different allegations that had emerged. One was that it didn't really happen at all. And then one that sort of went very mainstream was that this woman was an actor, that this event was staged. And this narrative started going mainstream quite quickly to the point where Sergei Lavrov had spoken about the theory, and a lot of Russian foreign accounts started posting about it. So the maternity hospital was long non-operational. Instead, it was used by the armed forces and radicals, this neo-Nazi group. Moreover, Russia warned the UN Security Council about this 3 days ago. And no, it's indeed this pregnant beauty blogger, Mariana Podgorskaya. She actually played roles of both pregnant women in the photos. The first photos were actually taken by a famous propagandist. So this went mainstream very quickly, and that image got spread very quickly. Now, we are so used to this. I just talked about Duma. We are so used to this now for these major events. So my team on day one, our thing is like, verify the image, verify the videos. What do we know happened? Get that out. Our day two of the story is often dealing with the counter narrative. So like, how do we, and again, my team's role is not to make a snap judgment. My team's role is to look at the claims and dismantle them or prove them step by step. So in this case, I mean, okay, let's see, like, so was she a pregnant beauty blogger? Yes, so we were actually able to track down her account. This was a post from late February where she had posted about being close to giving birth. So we knew that that part of the claim was true. Is she also seen on the stretcher? No, like, zoom in, it's not her. So, I mean, that's not a hard one. I think what was most offensive about this one is that this poor woman actually died. And it was just a very heartbreaking photograph. And there was images and videos from that AP photographer who, again, was doing that vital on-the-ground reporting. And it was very clear that this was not the same woman and that this woman was not an actor. So that is not true. Was this hospital operational? Yes. So multiple local officials said it was. We verified videos showing patients and doctors, and there was no evidence of a large military mass casualty event. So if this was a home of lots of soldiers, you would potentially expect to see lots of soldiers being carried out, injured. And obviously that vital on-the-ground reporting confirmed that it was operational. Had Russia warned that this hospital was taken over? No. So we actually went back to that statement and we figured, like, okay, let's see. Local residents report that having driven out the entire staff of Mariupol Maternity Hospital number 1, the Ukrainian armed forces set up a firing position there. Now, whatever about Mariupol Hospital number 1, this was Mariupol Hospital number 3. So it was a completely different place, and that idea that they had warned about it was not true. Again, we can prove this with the on-the-ground reporting and Google Maps. It's there, it's obvious. This is hospital number 3. Were the women actors? No. So these counter narratives, they're spread very quickly. And I think this is sort of the key thing I always tell people dealing in the disinformation space, as my team does. We often think about putting out a false narrative, and that is, trying to convince people of the false narrative. That is 100% a goal of disinformation. But a bigger goal is creating noise and inserting doubt. So it's about, well, what about, well, I'm not really sure about that. Are you sure about that? And the whole idea is to create so much noise and so much chaos that you don't know what to believe, so you kind of don't believe anything. And that's one of the reasons why, for these big stories, that these counter narratives come out so quickly. But I will say OSINT, which is open source intelligence, coupled with that on-the-ground reporting, can counter those false claims. Some people you're not going to reach, but it is important. And again, those two things work in tandem in any newsroom. So I want to talk for a moment about the spectrum of manipulation in the news. So my team was very much brought in because we are entering a new era of this stuff. But I will say 99% of what we deal with on a daily basis in terms of false claims is missing context. That is authentic footage, like we just saw, where context is omitted or misrepresented. That is sort of on the lower end of the spectrum. It's the easiest thing to do. It's a so-called cheap fake. So cheap fakes are quick and easy and they don't cost anything. Misleading editing is kind of in the middle. That's where you're like splicing and dicing something, or you're slowing down a video of Nancy Pelosi to make it sound like she's drunk, or you're clipping a statement from a politician and to make it sound like they said something they didn't. That's sort of in the middle. And then you've got the further end of the spectrum, which is synthetic media, and that is AI and manipulated content. So missing context, as I just said, real footage. it's not always nefarious. It's not always people seeking to spread misinformation. So this is one that went viral at the start of the Ukraine war. Ukraine husbands say goodbye to their wives. If you actually look this up, this is actually from a film in 2017. It was not from the start of the Ukraine war. But oftentimes people post stuff, they think it's real. You know, it's old footage that is reposted as new. So I just want to show you a very quick tool that you can use if you ever come across this yourselves in a newsroom. So there's a thing called reverse image search. You just click the top of your bar, and it brings up this magic searcher. And you can just highlight whatever image you want to check. And it'll bring up where this image has appeared online before. So I just scroll down here. I'm just going to pick on, like, just clicked one that was a fact check. And this brings me to a fact check. So if you're looking to do more on this, reverse image search is your best friend for old footage. Really, really helpful, and something my team uses day in, day out. This is another thing my team does all the time. So this is one that we did in the summer, the Houthis. So they keep claiming that this USS Eisenhower is on fire and it's been attacked. This is this carrier that sort of does the rounds. But they keep posting these accounts, which are, some of them are Russian, some of them are Chinese, but every time they say the Houthis has struck this ship, and they release video game footage. So this is like one of our biggest problems, is video game footage being represented as like real footage. And again, it's sort of like muddying the waters. It's like hoping you can throw stuff and maybe someone will believe it. But it's often kind of this low-level stuff that we're sort of dealing with day to day. And you know, I don't mean to downplay it, because like these are real people. There are real people on the vessel, and we've done some stories about sort of the impact of that as well. The next one is misleading editing, and I want to kind of shift gears a little bit, because I think just bringing it back to the US. So my team was extremely busy with the US election last year. And in particular, my team was covering Russian disinformation efforts. So we heard a lot about it in 2016. I think we heard less about it in 2024, which is probably a good thing. But in the lead up to the election, there was a lot of sort of coordinated disinformation, particularly in the form of video, that my team sort of dealt with. And a lot of it, the majority of it, was misleading editing. So we saw some use of AI. For example, this sort of AI video of a guy in a car who was saying that the First Lady of Ukraine had bought a Bugatti, and it was just very rudimentary, not very convincing. They released a few AI-related videos, but they just weren't very good. Their most successful videos were just cheap fakes. So again, misleading editing. I'm going to show you one example. So there's one Russian disinformation group, and by Russian disinformation groups, I mean these are groups that are somewhat connected to the government, but sort of operate in their own space. So people are familiar with like the Internet Research Agency. That no longer exists, but they're sort of offshoots of it. So these particular groups, they sort of develop their own styles. So there's this one group that we've been tracking for a while. And by tracking, I mean we follow the accounts they typically put stuff out on. We follow the type of footage that they produce. So when we see it on social media, we can kind of spot and we know it's them. So this was one that was released the week right before the election.
The FBI received more than 9,000 complaints about malfunctioning voting machines. They recorded votes for Kamala Harris. Voters in several states are reporting that an error occurs while using a voting machine, regardless of the voter's choice on the interactive screen.
So we don't need to watch any more of that. So as you can see, it's real footage, it's real stock images. They use the FBI logo, they use the Department of Justice logo. It looks like a real piece of footage, but it's not true. They also spoofed CBS News.
Tuesday night.
FBI. Americans should vote remotely due to high terrorist threat level. There is reportedly a high risk of verbal and physical provocation, mass violence, and acts of terrorism at polling stations this year. The situation is relevant throughout the United States. On November 5th, it is not recommended.
So again, they use our real graphics. So they take our real graphics, they use real footage, they kind of put it together. The voice is not very convincing, it's not very good. But again, this group in particular, they use the same technique in Europe, which was how we kind of recognized what they were doing and how we kind of followed their accounts. But what they do essentially is they create these videos, and the whole idea is throwing stuff at a wall. So it's really, some of it is to fool you, but a lot of it is just to put noise into the ecosystem. Now, around 2016, there was a lot of sort of talk about fake news and just false narratives in general. But actually, if you look at any of the reports that were done retrospectively, what they really focused on was jumping on talking points that were already resonating with Americans and just amplifying those more. So often with disinformation, it's not just about creating these fake stories, which can really have very limited reach. It's about amplifying division and amplifying this type of stuff. So in any newsroom, like we're kind of following this stuff, making sure that we're staying across it. But there's a separate group who are dubbed Storm 1516. So they all get these funny names from researchers. But this group is Storm 1516, and you might remember these guys. They produced a ton of videos right before the election where they staged events. So one was Bucks County in Pennsylvania. This video was released about a week before the election.
Fuck Donald Trump.
Oh yeah, and then they just, where they were saying basically that this was a polling station in Pennsylvania, they were ripping up ballots for Donald Trump. The next one was, this was on election night. This was one that got released when I was in the studio on election night. This was allegedly a polling place in Wisconsin, I think they said it was. But again, it was a Kamala Harris
Donald
supporter,
Trump.
and it was a Trump supporter, and they get into a fight, and the Trump supporter's on the ground. But I mean, there were very obvious things. Like my team, okay, I'll stop playing that now. So my team is tracking this stuff. But the minute we saw these videos, we knew exactly who posted it because they've been producing this stuff for a long time leading up to the election. So I want to talk a little bit about the ecosystem of how this stuff works. So it's all well and good to like look at a video and be able to verify it. But if you want to cover the ecosystem, you have to understand how this stuff spreads. You have to understand the groups. And for a team like mine, you have to understand how this stuff gets from its source to its end user to kind of spreading online. So often what will happen is a video like one of those gets seeded on social media, it'll get published online by one of these accounts. It'll get picked up by these news outlets that look like legitimate news outlets but are actually affiliated. And then it gets amplified through social media. So the whole idea is information laundering. So it means that the information comes from this person, but I launder it through several other different places, so you're not really sure where that information came from in the first place. So that is one of the things that my team worked a lot on over the last year. I want to talk for a moment before I finish up with synthetic media, but this is, if you're kind of going into journalism, thinking about journalism, working in the disinformation space, there is two competing ideals that you will be dealing with on any given day. One is the oxygen of amplification. The other is sunlight as a disinfectant. So the oxygen of amplification is if I'm covering these groups, if I'm talking about them right now, that's a win. They love that. They love the attention. And it amplifies their disinformation more by having a newsroom cover it. So we should typically tend to avoid this stuff. The other competing thing is sunlight as a disinfectant. So how are we going to inoculate people against believing false narratives unless we teach them the methods and unless we tell them what's out there? So, and any story, we're dealing with these types of things. I think around the election, so for the majority of things, like we're not covering Russian disinformation videos today because the impact is probably quite low. Around the election, there was a clear effort to sort of like prevent people from voting or maybe turn a few people off. And it was really important from just like a point of view of the public to educate people about this. But knowing that when you're also amplifying this stuff. So some of the things that my team thinks about, whether it's in conflict or in elections, is, has this story reached a tipping point? Does it help the audience to learn something important? Does it mitigate harm rather than amplifying misinformation? And does it avoid rewarding bad actors? So there were tons of stories we chose not to cover during the election that came from these groups just because it would amplify it. But often my team will decide to cover it if we feel that it's reached a level, like a tipping point. So finally, synthetic media. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but AI is obviously a big problem. We're really lucky at CBS News in that they've really invested in technology around this. So my team has access to like some of the best tools. I will tell you, the majority of what we do is manual, old-fashioned journalism. These tools are great, but they're obviously still developing. So synthetic media in itself is sort of a bigger concern. I'm going to give you 3 snapshots. So this was one from when I was kind of going into Storyful at the time. This is a deep fake of Barack Obama that got so much traction at the time. But often for like the last number of years, we've seen so many people like warning about deep fakes, creating deep fakes to show you they're very realistic. I think this was definitely very helpful, but I also think it served to make people believe that creating AI-generated content and convincing AI-generated content is easier than it actually is. It's actually quite difficult. The second one was this Zelensky deepfake. So around the early days of the Ukraine war, this deepfake came out basically where Zelensky was saying, lay down your arms, we give in. Obviously fake. And it was an obvious fake. Like his head didn't look right. It was a different color. Like the mouth wasn't moving correctly. These were like the early days where there was sort of more people got access to creating AI-generated images and videos. And it just wasn't very good. I think we're reaching a tipping point very soon. This is one from that we were covering last week. And this was basically a video of celebrities. So after Kanye West's recent conduct at the Super Bowl, this video came out of a ton of celebrities where they were giving him the finger, Kanye West the finger, basically. And this video was so convincing. Like, so many people were convinced that this was real. And I think it was one of the first times where I kind of went like, okay. Now, the good news is that I actually slowed it down and I chose this clip in particular. If you actually look at the hands in all of the videos, the hands are not right. So I was like, thank God. Okay, we still have some clues. So in this case, you can see here that the hands are not right. But I had to download the video and like play it really slowly to pick it out. So AI is getting better. We're definitely getting to that point. I think the biggest problem I have is that people think it's more powerful than it actually is. And that really plays into the hands of bad actors who can then say that, well, it's AI. That's not real. How do I know what to believe? So I get a lot of questions about things where I'm like, that's clearly not AI because it's too good. So we're sort of at that tipping point right now, I think. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. Like I start out my 3 little snapshots from my career of how things changed. I think for the next generation of journalists, you're going to have your own 3 snapshots, and I think you'll probably be starting with a snapshot of AI. But I do want to end on a more positive note. I mean, we have seen how newsrooms are cutting costs. There are job losses all around. I think that's kind of always been the case throughout my career. The bad actors are getting more sophisticated, but newsrooms are getting better as well. So I think newsrooms are also getting more sophisticated at this stuff. The investment is there in a lot of newsrooms. And it also forces newsrooms to be transparent. We're not just telling you what we know, we're showing you how we know what we know. And that's sort of a core tenet to open source journalism. And I also think, for the next generation of journalists as well, like it's exciting. Because there's all this noise out there, I think the role of a trusted newsroom, a trusted journalist and it's such a cliche, but has never been more important. And I truly believe that. I think we're going through a rebalancing right now, but I do think for that next generation of journalists, I think that role is so important. So yeah, I will leave it there. And thank you very much.
So thank you, Rhona. That was really eye-opening and a kind of window into the future. We certainly know, as our dean, Laura Lindenfeld, was saying at the beginning, truth has never been more important than it is now, with so much disinformation infecting everything that we see. So Rhona's job's important, but it's also important for all our students and for everyone to really learn about how to counter disinformation effectively. And as ever with journalism, it's about do the research. It's about, get out there, look at the evidence. That's what we do every day, whether we're in the field or we're watching things in the internet space. So it's such an important insight that you gave us today, Rhona. Thank you very much. Now we've got time for questions. There are going to be mics. Maybe they're there already. I can't see because of the lights. But there are mics on either side. So please do come forward if you've got a question. Who'd like to go first? We have a volunteer.
Okay, so my question, hi.
State your name as well.
I'm Grace.
Hi, Grace.
Hi, nice to meet you. So my question was regarding in the beginning of your presentation when you showed how you would insert, I guess, like buzzwords and it would translate. So would it be, does it translate it back for you, or do you have to have someone that specifically speaks that language to go through all of that information? Because how would someone who doesn't speak, say, like Spanish go through it and not be confused?
Oh no, it's such a great question. So Google Translate is your best friend. So how I would search in other languages is, first of all, I would put the English words into Google Translate and I would build a string search. I would also use ChatGPT. So I would say, give me Arabic words related to XYZ, and I would use those. And then what I also do is I go to Arabic news reports and I use Google Translate. And then what I do is I pull the Arabic words, specific Arabic words out of that, and I build a string search. So use your online tools and then use your native languages. So if it's, for example, like Ukrainian, I go to the Ukrainian reports, I translate certain words as I'm going through it, and then I copy and paste those into a string search. So that's a technical answer, but basically the language barrier should not stop you. I'm terrible at languages and I can still search in different languages. So
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up? Is it better though to have somebody on site who speaks?
Oh, massively.
Yeah.
Massively. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're lucky at CBS in that we have, like, I'll often send like an Arabic speaker a video and be like, can you listen to this for me? So we use those as like rough translations, but when you're working open source, you have to be like almost an expert in everything and speak several different languages. So we do the best of what we have, but obviously a native speaker is much preferred.
And we have another questioner.
Hello, I'm Melanie.
Hi.
I have a question. So there's so much disinformation and misinformation, as we know. A lot of people don't believe it, even if you show them this is fake, especially family and friends.
Yeah.
So how do you just tell them that this really isn't true, even though sometimes they don't believe you, even with the facts right there?
That's such a great question. I think for me in my role as a journalist, I want to do my best. I want to present the facts in the most measured, clear, straightforward way. And then the rest is not up to me. It's really not up to me to change people's minds. So I think for me in my type of work, because often we're dealing with really devastating and terrible stories a lot of the time, I have to let go of the outcome of my work. Like, I can't go into every story feeling like I'm going to change anything. So it's sort of, for me, it's about doing the work the best you can and finding the meaning in the work rather than finding the meaning in changing people's minds. So I would just say it's probably not your responsibility. Just focus on do the work, because you drive yourself crazy. You would drive yourself crazy.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. And in this day and age, truth is so important. But the question is, how do you get someone to believe that you're the trustworthy source and not the other source? For example, you could watch Fox News and you think that they're the trusted source, and their narrative is completely different than CNN, MSNBC. Question is, how do you get the attention to say, believe us, don't believe them?
It's such a good question. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges in journalism right now, right? Like that, how do we get our audience to trust us? I think CBS News has always done a very good job in transparency. For me, that's sort of the biggest weapon in our arsenal is being as transparent as possible with the audience. So anytime that we are doing anything, say, for example, with fact checking, we always want to make clear our sources are as transparent as possible. So I'm not just telling you this is fact, I'm showing you where it came from. But I think it's a huge challenge. Like, I don't know that I have an answer to how do we get people to start going back to legacy news organizations. I think it's going to happen. I think with all this noise, there's distractions, but I think the role and the rise of the independent journalist is a good sign because it shows that people will believe other people, and it's about maintaining that credibility. But I wish I had a silver bullet, but I really don't. I think it's just being about as transparent as possible with the audience.
Yeah, if I can jump in as well, I think there are different stories. So for example, you might find that different channels have different interpretations of events,
Right.
but by and large, they don't actually put out fake videos. Now, there are bad actors who do, and who, you know, put out all kinds of nonsense. But I like to think that there is still a media world in which you don't deliberately put out fake or AI information, you know, unless it's sort of coming direct from, you know, a Russian television program or something. Now, call me naive, but I think there's still some of that. What do you think? That sort of, that there's a belief in certain facts and accuracy of video that most channels would stick to, even if their interpretation of events is different.
I think so. I mean, I like to think so. I think I stay optimistic about the state of journalism in general. I think, yeah, like to what you're speaking to, like the idea of putting out something that is outright false, I think that keeps most journalists up at night. I know it certainly does with me. I've been verifying videos for many, many years. And the idea that I might have gotten something wrong would definitely keep me up at night. But I do think there's sort of, there's an opinion journalism, I think, that has seeped into how people view all of journalism. So they think that opinion journalism on television is what all of journalism is. And it has opinion journalism has a very valuable space. But I think people are sometimes confusing that with, for example, like CBS Evening News, which is all opinion and analysis. And trying to explain that to people often, it sort of gets lost.
Yeah. And I think Fox News did pay an enormous sum of money for pumping out absolute nonsense and about election fraud. So let's hope they learned their lesson there.
Yeah.
It certainly caused some sober reactions at places like Newsmax and OAN, didn't it? When, you know,
Right.
the sort of smaller down the food chain of news sources. Okay, next question, please.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is around the format or the media itself. Specifically, how do you balance that depth and that trying to achieve credibility through detail with you know, the limited attention span of the modern media consumer? Right? How do you sort of thread the needle between you know, getting people's attention, but also demonstrating your credibility?
I think that's where, and it's such a great question. Like when we were putting out those videos, like no one knew the amount of effort that we put into making sure they were authentic. They just saw the videos. So people often don't know. I think that's where the role of visual investigations comes in. So when I was at Storyful, we used to work very closely with the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal on their visual investigations. And this is where you're talking the audience through exactly how you verified something, how you've put together a timeline. I think those are probably the most powerful way. And I think for any newsroom, and I think CBS has been pretty good as well, of like leaving space for that type of journalism. I think there's an audience for it as well. But I do agree with you on a day-to-day. Sometimes we try to slip it in, like you'll try to be like, well, this is how we know this. But there's very limited space to actually show people how we know what we know. I think that's one of the reasons why CBS News Confirmed was set up as well. The whole idea behind it is to show the audience how it's made. Like, I don't know that the American public would understand, or any public, the Irish public too, where I'm from, how many steps my team will go through to make sure that piece of footage that is getting to air is authentic. And I think newsrooms need to do a better job with helping the audience to understand like how we know what we know, particularly for types of stuff, because I don't think people know that there's a standards department, that like everything has to go through standards. What even is standards? So that's part of our role and our remit in CBS as well, is to make that stuff more transparent.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
So Grace again, but
Hello.
so my question is, I know you said you like to keep it like very optimistic and everything, but what would your response be to the people that say that journalism is a dying art and there's not going to be any more forms of journalism media that are really important because of social media? And also, like, what would your words of advice be to someone who wants to study journalism but is looking for something that's going to be lucrative in the future and isn't feeding into the negativity that is being put out around journalism?
Well, I think in one sense, it's always been difficult to get into journalism. So when I was in college, the bottom fell out of the newspaper business in Ireland, and there were job losses everywhere. You could not get a job as a journalist. I had to work for free for so long. By the time I actually got a real job, I didn't know how it worked. I was like, do I pay you? Do you pay me? Like, how does this work? So it's always been really difficult. So it can feel like when you might be coming out at the worst time. It's always been a terrible time. But I do think there's a massive appetite. I just know this from being at CBS and our audience. There's such a massive appetite for context, for deep storytelling, for reflecting back at communities. I think the opinion thing only goes so far. I think like deep reporting, there'll always be an audience for it. It'll just feel really hard for a few years when you're trying to get into it. I think especially, sometimes you can feel like, you have to go to the best college, and then you have to get the best internship, and then you get the best AP job, and then you get the producer job, and then you get, there's a stepping stone. I will tell you, like anybody I know who's successful in journalism, it's been a long and winding road that hasn't been straight. So it's always going to be difficult. So I would say, yes, it's a very hard time for journalism. There are still opportunities out there. You just have to like really love it. And I mean like really love it. Like it has to like kick you and, beat you down, and you still want to do it. And I think if you are that type of person and you still really want to do it, you will succeed and you will be able to do journalism and to do well in it. But it's a tough industry. There's no doubting that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Rhona's an example of somebody who works in a growing field in journalism. So there are fields that are expanding. So please don't lose hope, because actually when I started off as a journalist years ago, half the newspapers were out on strike because it was going through a big old technological revolution. And, and before that, there were always stories about loss-making papers and publications. And that's why you always had these sort of owners with deep pockets, the sort of Jeff Bezos who owns the Washington Post. That's nothing new, so in some ways, and it's an expanding industry.
It is. It is.
There are more, there's more news out there all the time, but there's also this loud volume of disinformation.
Right.
And, that's why the journalists among us who are truth tellers, I think, are so important.
Yeah, and I mean, I've heard a lot of young people into like Storyful and again at CBS who've like gone on and done great things, have had fantastic careers, particularly in this space. I think if you get into this space, you can kind of go work anywhere. That's what my boss said to me at the time when I was leaving broadcast. He said you can go work anywhere, and he was right. It took me 7 years, but he was right. So I think there are always opportunities there. But it's just tough. But I will say, like on my team, I have 3 senior people, and none of us went the traditional straightforward path into anything. It was meandering. We took jobs, we worked in one thing, we moved into another. It's a long road. So I would just say, like, if you really want to do it, just stick with it.
Yeah, and the other thing is something that Kat Colvin brought up, which was that it was very, very difficult for journalists to operate freely in Syria. And now they're going back there and they can operate again. There are opportunities for foreign correspondents. Unfortunately, conflict never seems to be something that ends in this world. But, when you think of how Syria was frozen for over a decade, and now reporters are going back in and telling amazing stories there, there's always hope. Right. And there's always an audience for a riveting story.
Right.
Any more questions? Well, in that case, it remains to me to thank Rhona. You've been brilliant. You've been a great window.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. I mean, you're a window into a world that we see for ourselves on social media, but we don't always know how to analyze or to understand what we're watching. And I think you really put it into a great context. And I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank Dean Lindenfeld for the amazing support she gives to the Colvin Centre, and to Kat Colvin for everything that she's done from the very beginning of this centre to today, everything that she does to honour her sister's memory. And I know her sister would be very proud of everything that Kat does. Thank you, Ivana, as well, for your support. Thank you so much to all our friends from who've done so much to help the Colvin Centre, for coming tonight and for listening to Rhona, our distinguished lecturer. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Great. Very good.